Okay, how's everybody doing out there? I'm out here on my deck. This is the third time that I've tried to record this. We've been having some difficulties. Hey Monty, you wanna come here? My dog Monty is out here with me. You can see him here. Hey buddy, how's it going? You gonna lay down and take a nap? So you might hear some dogs, you might hear some kids playing in the background. But I thought it would be nice to get out and get some fresh air. I hope you're doing the same thing where you are, and hopefully this take will work with our NMDA lecture. Okay, so let's get started with ecstasy, the chemical name MDMA. So there's a myth about ecstasy being a relatively safe drug, and part of that myth centers around three things, really. One, ecstasy doesn't produce over-the-top effects. It has very subtle sort of behavioral effects. It's very hard to overdose on ecstasy, although there are significant adverse effects that can occur, and people do die under the influence of ecstasy. And it's hard to define short-term consequences. So the typical use of ecstasy is sporadic, and we don't see withdrawal. You have to do some significant use in order to start to see adverse effects. And by that time, the adverse effects that you're seeing are the result of neural damage. And so that once the damage is done, it's hard to go backwards from that. And so that's why I say that it's a myth that it's safe, because it's really a fairly dangerous drug. The behavioral effects are very positive. People refer to it as happiness in a pill. And in fact, in the 1970s, for a brief period of time, ecstasy was used in therapy sessions to help clients have empathy, particularly in resolving conflict with other people, like in a marital counseling type of setting. But once we learned of the negative effects of ecstasy, that practice was discontinued. There's a lot of things out there that claim to be ecstasy or like ecstasy that are not actually NMDA. Some of that can be fairly dangerous concoctions. Some of it is relatively safe. So this herbal ecstasy that you see here on the right-hand side is not in MDMA, but rather is a high dose of ephedrine and caffeine. And therefore it's labeled as a dietary supplement instead of as an actual drug or chemical. Again, labeling it as a dietary supplement, people think, okay, this is relatively safe. Actually, ephedrine, we talked about that when we talked about caffeine, is a fairly dangerous chemical, and it's actually not allowed on the market in the US anymore. All right, so what is ecstasy then? What is NMDA? It is a synthetically produced chemical made from methamphetamine. So here's the chemical structure for amphetamine, and here's the structure for methamphetamine. If we look at the structure for methamphetamine, we add a carboxyl group to get MDMA. And so that's MDMA on the bottom of the screen there. And again, it has very subtle stimulant and perceptual effects that very different from methamphetamine, not as addictive as methamphetamine, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so administration. Typically, you find this in pill form. It's about the only way that you find it. The average dose is around 100 milligrams, although it can vary to be slightly lower or slightly higher than 100 milligrams. Users typically take multiple doses of this throughout an administration session. So ecstasy is often used when people go out partying to clubs or that sort of setting, out for a night, and so they may take 2 or 3 doses in a setting. The set dosage, because it's in pill form and the dosage is set, that's not going to account for body weight differences. And so when 2 users are using the same amount, one could be getting a different effect because they have smaller body weight than the other. readily absorbed in the digestive system. There's no ionization issues, and it's subject to first-pass metabolism through the liver. Talking about metabolism and excretion, and the time course of the drug, it has a fairly quick onset of about 15 minutes, and it peaks within 90 minutes to 2 hours. It has a long half-life of 8 hours, but the behavioral effects are relatively short, lasting anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, depending on the dose and depending on redosing. Right? This is why I say some users might redose over the course of a 4 or 5 hour session being out at night. It takes 40 hours to be effectively eliminated because of the long half-life, and there can be some residual effects, but not usually. MDMA is metabolized to MDA, which is also an active chemical and can act in a similar way to MDMA. And it doesn't have to be metabolized in order to be excreted. It can be excreted directly, or the metabolite can be excreted, either one. So what exactly is MDMA doing? Well, here's a serotonin synapse, and it works primarily on serotonin. And serotonin is removed from the synapse in 2 ways, through reuptake, through the transporter protein that you see here, and through the monoamine oxidase enzyme. So ecstasy comes in, blocks that transporter protein, and in doing so, that's going to increase the amount of serotonin that is present. It also stimulates the release of serotonin, and so it's sort of having 2 effects of preventing serotonin from getting back into the neuron and causing increased release of serotonin. Both of those are going to result in excess serotonin throughout the synapse and a depletion of serotonin in the vesicles, because we're not allowing that neuron to take the serotonin back up and reuse it. So it's a potent agonist for serotonin, and it's a less effective agonist for both dopamine and oxytocin. Dopamine's going to obviously be working on the nucleus accumbens and the reward circuitry, but it also works on dopamine in the basal ganglia and produces, that's part of the stimulating effect of ecstasy. And oxytocin is a complex neurotransmitter. You think it's involved with bonding. There's some evidence that it's released when people trust one another, and so that might be some of these empathetic effects that we see of ecstasy. So as I mentioned, it's having its action as an agonist on serotonin, both through increasing release and blocking the reuptake and MAO enzymes. That's going to also, in addition to enhancing serotonin in the synapse, that's going to reduce feedback to the neuron, and it's going to result in a secondary effect where we get depletion of those levels of serotonin. And so that can result in a condition called serotonin syndrome that I'll talk about in a minute. Just to refresh your memory, the Raphe nucleus is the supplier of serotonin. There's long diffuse pathways throughout the brain, and there's also an activation of the sympathetic nervous system from the Raphe nucleus as well. So these are some of the areas that we see: the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, basal ganglia that I mentioned, and then the diffuse projections throughout the entire neocortex. Each of those areas is going to have specific behavioral effects associated with it. So in the hypothalamus, we're going to have reduced appetite, but we're also going to have effects on body temperature, elevated body temperature, and in the amygdala and hippocampus, we're going to have effects on both mood and memory. And as I mentioned, the stimulating effects happen through dopamine in basal ganglia. And then you get the limbic system involved in the frontal lobe and heightened perceptions throughout the whole neocortex. So those behavioral effects, sometimes people in clinical studies have not been able to discriminate between either LSD and ecstasy or amphetamines and ecstasy, and that's because ecstasy's 2 major effects are as a stimulant and with some hallucinogenic properties. Not really hallucinations per se that you would see with LSD or PCP, but more of the distortions of perception. We called those illusions, I think, when we talked about hallucinations. So, and also much milder than you would see with those hallucinogenic drugs that are listed there. Primarily, the distortions on perception are on time perception and on psychedelic stimuli, so auditory and visual stimuli. And again, this is why people often take ecstasy in a club-like setting where there's lots of music and lights. It does provide that stimulation, that stimulant effect of increased energy through the basal ganglia, but also through activating the sympathetic nervous system. And one of the major adverse effects of ecstasy is increased body temperature. People sometimes become reflective and will have long conversations under the influence of ecstasy, but what they're saying doesn't always make sense, so it's not always lucid. Again, these are some of the adverse effects: clouded thinking, disruptive behavior, and the hypothermia in the hypothalamus. There can also be arrhythmia associated with it due to Rathe's control of cardiac function in the heart, and in some individuals, you will see a jaw clenching that's associated with stimulating that pathway. The life-threatening effects, there's really three. As I mentioned before, it has a big therapeutic index, so you're unlikely to overdose in the traditional sense, but high dose and increased use, repetitive use, results in that elevated body temperature, which often results in dehydration, can result in arrhythmias and cardiac problems with cardiac function. And the combination of the high body temperature and the dehydration can cause kidney failure. Any one of those three can become lethal, and people often, because they know that the body temperature is elevated and they're also maybe dancing or more active or in a very hot environment, consume large amounts of water, and that can result in a condition called hyponatremia, where you get a swelling of the brain because there's not enough sodium in the extracellular solution. One study of ecstasy deaths reported sort of a wide variety of those complications. So cardiovascular, about 10%, liver damage, about 5%, hyponatremia, about 10%. Over a third of the ecstasy deaths were a result of overheating. There is a higher instance of accidental deaths or suicide. That has to do with the clouded thinking aspect of it. And then 25% of the deaths under the influence of ecstasy were undetermined. They're undetermined that ecstasy was that cause of death. They're related to the cause of death. So as we mentioned, under the influence of ecstasy, you get that elevated mood because we're blocking reuptake and increasing exocytosis. That can result in that serotonin syndrome. So after the ecstasy use, because we've depleted the serotonin and not allowed that neuron to recycle its serotonin, you get a lack of serotonin, and so you can have depression-like feelings and irritability, trouble sleeping, all the things that serotonin is involved with. You think about having not enough serotonin in the brain, you get those side effects, and that's called the serotonin syndrome. Now, there used to be some debate about whether or not these changes in the brain that we see in animals also happen in humans. I think there's considerable evidence now to suggest that we do have similar effects. There is individual variability, and in your case study this week, you'll meet Lynn Smith and see some of the long-term effects that she's had as a result of taking ecstasy. So, we got neighborhood kids out here. That's great. Sounds like they're having fun dealing with this thing. So back to our lecture. This is a primate neocortex where we've labeled the serotonin neurons. You see it, they're very long processes. They tend to cluster in the layers, the cortical layers, that neocortex area near the surface of the brain. This is an animal 2 weeks after a typical dose that a human might take. And so this is 350 milligrams given to the monkey over 4 days. And you see, even 2 weeks later, significant depletion of serotonin in the monkey's brain. Here are 3 different animals under normal settings with no exposure to MDMA. And then this is 1.5 years after exposure to MDMA, a different study here. And I want you to notice that you do see variability. So the animals on the left and the right show far greater serotonin depletion than the animal in the middle. The animal in the middle still shows serotonin depletion, but not at the same levels that you see in B and F. Back to that other study of primates, they looked at very long-term effects. So this is 7 years after ecstasy, and you do see increases in serotonin. So some of that serotonin depletion can recover, but there's also a significant decrease from the normal setting. And so there can be long-term, very long-term effects, we think, of this. And again, you'll see this in Lynn Smith's case study. Normal brain, former ecstasy user, where we are now doing a PET scan for serotonin, and you see the decrease in serotonin there in the former ecstasy user. So how much is too much, and when does this damage occur? And that's always sort of the magic question, and we don't exactly know. Certainly heavy usage causes this. It looks like the typical doses that users would use in a weekend binge session can cause serotonin damage. And the more times you do that, the more extensive that damage is going to be. So when ecstasy blocks that serotonin transporter, it can damage it, and if it damages the axon terminals, then you get degeneration of the entire serotonin neuron and loss of that neuron that can't be replaced in the central nervous system. This is a study looking at cognitive effects in non-users, which is going to be the bar outside of the graph there on the left-hand side of each of those 4 graphs, the 4 different cognitive tests. And then they also further broke down the users into light users and heavy users. The light users were anywhere from 22 to 50 applications of ecstasy over their lifetime. The heavy users were 60 to over 400 applications of ecstasy. And so that's plotted along the x-axis from light users to heavy users. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a spatial task where there's not a huge dramatic effect on that. In the bottom left-hand side, we see the RSAT, which is a task that measures people's ability to judge outcomes or payoffs. So here they're discriminating between high and low payoff targets in a gambling game. Again, no real correlation across the usage of ecstasy. Then we get to the 2 on the right-hand side, and these are frontal lobe tasks. So the top one is a street color task, where you see the word black, but it's in blue, or the word blue and it's in brown, and you have to say the color, not the word. And here we see that users are making are having interference more often, the heavy users are, than the light users or the controls. Same thing with the Wisconsin card sorting. So the Wisconsin card sorting test, you're having to identify different categories, whether you're sorting the cards by color or shape or number, and the heavier users are not able to complete as many categories in that test. Effects on memory, we see effects on memory due to its impact on the hippocampus. So in green, you see our control subjects and their immediate recall and delayed recall, and you notice those aren't very different in terms of numbers of items able to be recalled. Polydrug users is another control. These are people that have used multiple drugs but not having used ecstasy. And that's important because most of the time ecstasy users are using other drugs in addition to ecstasy. They're not solely using ecstasy, even if that's only alcohol, but often it's maybe cocaine or marijuana as well. When you add in ecstasy, in the current users and ex-users in this study, we see further decrease in memory. And the difference between ex-users and current users is probably due to the amount of use. So why did they stop using and become an ex-user? They may have used enough to have started to notice negative side effects and damage. All right, so in terms of tolerance, as I mentioned, this ecstasy use is usually sporadic in nature. And so because it's not taken in close repetition, we don't know as much about tolerance. Certainly it's going to deplete serotonin and downregulate serotonin. We can see that side effect. There's downregulation of the postsynaptic receptors depending on how much use and how chronic the use is. So both of those effects would suggest that you would need more ecstasy in order to achieve the same effects. And indeed, that's what Lynn Smith reports in the case study you're going to watch this week, that she began to use ecstasy to feel normal rather than to achieve a high. In terms of withdrawal, there is both mild acute effects from single doses, but there can also be long-term chronic effects in that serotonin syndrome. So the cognitive effects that we already mentioned are primarily depression, but can be memory or impulsivity, lack of attention, areas of frontal lobe function, like we saw in those cognitive tests. Sleep disturbances because of serotonin's role in helping you fall asleep, so you can have insomnia, and then again, lack of sleep or improper sleep cycles is going to produce its own negative cognitive effects. There can be a compensation for the higher body temperature under the influence, where you now have a lower body temperature in the withdrawal phase. That's usually more of an acute, immediately after effect. And in the central nervous system, it looks like after a single dose of NMDA, we get serotonin levels returning to normal around 2 to 3 weeks. But after chronic use, that may persist for quite a long time, as we saw. In terms of addiction, again, because of the sporadic use, we don't typically see physical dependence, but because of the presence of those withdrawal effects, sometimes people do report using it to get over withdrawal. Animals show voluntary use. There's obviously a positive reinforcement model here. Humans take repeated dosage, and because that dosage is usually in a similar environment or situation, like going out partying, going to certain places or clubs, even if it's not the same club, if it's the same dance music and lights and that sort of thing, there's definitely a conditioning that happens that's associated with ecstasy, and so there can be psychological cravings. Lynn reports on that in her case study as well. So positive reinforcement coupled with learning and conditioning, and maybe some relief from withdrawal benefits associated with that. All right, so that is our lecture for this week. I hope you're doing well and that you're staying safe. And Monty's chilling down there. Hey, buddy. Oh, he's enjoying the outside. I hope you're getting outside and having some sort of recreation in this time. I think we're getting close to being on the other side of this thing, and that'll be good for all of us. Just to go over what we have this week and what we have coming up. We have our next class meeting next Monday, our Zoom virtual meeting, and I will divide you up into random groups to start working on your projects, so make sure that you have some ideas for your projects ready to share with your group members. You have the case study for ecstasy this week and a worksheet on that, and I will hopefully, with better success, be posting a lecture on cannabis as well. Stay safe. Be nice to your family. I know it's hard being cooped up in the house all together. And if you have any questions, you can always reach me on email. I look forward to seeing everybody next Monday.